Welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Today is Monday, March 24th, day 535 of the war. Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our military reporter, Emmanuel Fabian. Hi, Manny. Thanks for joining me today.
Hi, Amanda.
Just prior to recording, a man was shot dead in a suspected terror attack in the north. Manny will update us on what we know so far. We're also going to learn about a series of strikes in the past week on senior Hamas officials, as the IDF appears to be expanding its ground offensive in the Gaza Strip. So we'll hear what is happening on the ground so far. And over the weekend, Israel's border with Lebanon again heated up. And what do we know about these rockets that were shot into Israel and Israel's response? All this and more when we're back. A 75-year-old man was shot dead in a suspected terror attack near the northern town of Yokne'am, the Magen David Adom ambulance service said this morning. Another person has been injured in the attack, and the terrorist was apparently killed at the scene. Manny, what can you tell us about this suspected terrorist attack in the north?
So from the very initial information that we're getting, this terrorist, we don't know his identity yet. For certain, but we are hearing that he may be an Israeli civilian rather than a Palestinian that infiltrated into Israel. But regardless, this attacker was driving outside Yokne'am. He rammed his vehicle into a young man who was at a bus station at this junction, and after hitting him with his vehicle, he got out the car and then stabbed the same person. And then he had a weapon on him. It's not clear yet if this was a weapon he had initially, or if maybe he took it from the victim at the scene, or if it was from somewhere else. But then he opened fire using this weapon on a vehicle driving on the other side of the highway, hitting this 70-year-old man who was then killed. And then as this was happening, border police officers who were in the area, I think police said that they were heading to a training exercise, and they stopped on the road and they opened fire and killed this attacker. So that's the very initial information that we have. This could, of course, the details could change, of course, once the police have investigated this attack further.
And until now, we don't know any kind of motivation. We don't know anything really about the suspected terrorist itself. So at this point, it can't 100% be labeled as a terrorist attack. Would you agree with that, Manny?
I think police are already calling this a terrorist attack, but it is true, we still don't know who the perpetrator is yet. But I'm sure in the coming hours that they'll be figured out by police and probably also by the Shin Bet, who normally get involved in terror attacks, the investigation of the terror attack.
Okay, so please check out our live blog for more information on this attack. Now let's turn to what's happening in Gaza. And an Israeli airstrike on a Gaza hospital killed a senior member of Hamas's political bureau last night as the military moved to expand its renewed offensive across the Strip. Likewise, this morning, Palestinian media has reported several deaths in an IDF strike on southern Gaza's Khan Yunis, and named one of those killed as Manar Abu Khater, who is the director of education in the Eastern Khan Yunis Education Directorate for the Strip's Hamas government. So, as was pointed out in a piece written by our colleague Nurit Yochanan, most of the senior Hamas officials who have been killed since the renewed fighting are not from the military wing. And it just makes me wonder, why are they being targeted right now as opposed to the previous 17 months of war?
I think that they would have been targeted in the previous 17 months of war had Israel known about where they were. So it may seem like that over the past week, many Hamas political officials have been targeted and killed. But if you look at the list of Hamas's political bureau and how many members they had, there was, I think, 21 or 22 members. Some of them aren't actually part of the bureau, but it's around 20 members of the bureau. So 3 have been killed in the past couple of weeks, but 7 or 8 more were killed in the early months of the war. Really, during the first weeks of the war, there were several of these political officials who were killed. In July, the I guess de facto prime minister of Hamas, Rouhi Mushta, was killed in a strike, and then his replacement, Issam Dalis, was killed a couple days ago, and then the replacement of Dalis was the Hamas official who was killed last night in Khan Yunis. Barham was his name. So what it seems to me is that this has been something that Israel's been doing since day one of the war, and I think very early on in the war, Israel said that it's trying to remove Hamas, both its military force and its civil force, its grip on the population in Gaza. So it's not a new thing that Israel's targeting their political officials, but now with the resumption of the fighting in Gaza, Israel's going back at it and targeting these officials. And I think there's also the fact that we were in a ceasefire for several weeks. I think that gave Israel an opportunity to gather intelligence on where these officials are. During the war, many of them were in hiding, including in tunnels with the military officials. They went underground. But then during the ceasefire, we had 2 months of a ceasefire. These civilian officials and even the Hamas military officials were walking around in public, and I think that gave Israel an opportunity to gather intelligence on them. So that's why we've seen so many of these political officials being targeted in recent days, but not just. The army also announced yesterday that 2 Hamas military commanders, relatively senior Hamas military commanders, were also killed. I think the reason why these are being announced slightly later is because it takes the time for the army to actually verify that they were killed. With the Hamas political officials, Hamas usually announce themselves that they were killed, so that makes the IDF's job a lot easier. With the military commanders, Hamas normally hasn't really announced any of them during the war, maybe 1 or 2. So the army announced that it killed the deputy commander of the Gaza City brigade and the commander of the Shajaiya battalion, which is in the Gaza City brigade. The commander of the Shajaiya battalion is actually the 3rd one since the beginning of the war. So in December 2023, the first commander was killed. A week later, the second commander was killed, and then he replaced those 2. But then he's been in the role for the past year and several months now. So now he was killed. But there are other, as far as I understand, there are other Hamas military officials that Israel has targeted during its initial airstrikes in Gaza in the last few days. But it's still verifying their identities. It's a lot more difficult to get the intelligence on those because Hamas is less public about announcing those deaths.
Who is currently in charge of Hamas's military wing in Gaza?
It is believed that it's Mohammed Sinwar, the brother of the former leader of Hamas, Yahya Sinwar. Mohammed Sinwar used to be a senior commander in Hamas in charge of the South Gaza area, from what I understand. And then he was basically promoted to lead the military wing of the terror group after the death of Mohammed Def and his deputy during Israeli strikes in Gaza. That's from what we understand. And he, of course, is believed to be in hiding in Gaza. And I don't doubt that Israel is looking for him. Israeli officials have publicly said that he is wanted and Israel seeks to kill him. It's a question of gathering the intelligence and making sure that any operation to kill him doesn't harm hostages who are being held in Gaza.
Let's talk about, in addition to these targeted strikes on the Hamas officials, let's talk about what's happening on the ground right now. And Israel has redeployed or deployed for the first time several troops and brigades. So tell us, plus minus, how much of the Gaza Strip is now again under IDF control?
So the army is deployed in several areas of Gaza, and it's a little bit different to what we saw in the beginning of the ground offensive, where, if you remember, the army went only into North Gaza in the beginning, and then later into Center Gaza, and then later into South Gaza. So right now, the army is deployed to all areas of Gaza, sort of north, south, and center, but it's not a major offensive yet. So we've seen troops enter the Tel Sultan neighborhood and the Yibneh camp of Rafah in the south. In the north, the army is pushed into Beit Hanoun and along the beach, on the coast, basically, of North Gaza. And And then in the center, the army's pushed into the Netzarim corridor again, the corridor that it used to hold, but not all of it. Only about half of it is now being held by the IDF. So those operations right now are being carried out by 2 IDF divisions, the Gaza division, which is anyway responsible for the Gaza area and the border, and the 252nd Reserve Division. So relatively limited amount of forces are carrying out these operations, but the army announced yesterday that it had deployed the 36th Division back to the Southern Command after many, many months of operations in Lebanon. This potentially, if Israel wants to expand the operation, this means many thousands more soldiers would be redeployed to Gaza and to join this ground offensive. So when Israel wants to expand this operation into a major ground invasion of Gaza again, then this division would likely be leading it. And I think even Israel may deploy an additional division to the Southern Command as well. I think at the height of the war, in the beginning of the war, there were 5 divisions in Gaza. So it will be likely 3 in the coming weeks, perhaps. But it could, of course, go beyond that, and Israel could deploy many, many more thousands of troops to Gaza.
And one of the major differences from the height of the war is, of course, that there is no evacuation zone anymore, as far as I understand it, Manny. And so residents, when they're being asked to evacuate, they're being asked to evacuate from all parts of the Gaza Strip, or have they even been asked to evacuate yet, Manny?
There's been a few evacuation orders for certain areas. And interestingly, as you point out, they've been told to evacuate to known shelters, as the army calls them. So recognized humanitarian shelters, normally based out of schools or next to hospitals, where there's basically a displaced person's camp set up with tents and facilities and things like that. But the humanitarian zone, as we knew it beforehand, where the army always called on Palestinians to head to, is no longer in the army's maps. It's gone now. There's no humanitarian zone anymore. It didn't stop Israel from striking in the zone anyway. There were several strikes in the zone. I think Mohammed Def was even killed in the humanitarian zone, if I remember correctly. So Israel's removed that whole concept, and instead is just calling on Palestinians to move from one area to another and head for shelters in that area, and to try and mitigate civilian harm by sending civilians to those areas. But it's definitely a different situation now that we saw from the early months of the war.
And of course, when the strikes last night or the night before that killed one of the Hamas officials was in a hospital. And so these hospitals are again being used, it's assumed by the IDF, as some kind of fortress for the Hamas officials.
So with Ismail Barham, Hamas is claiming at least that he was undergoing treatment there for injuries that he sustained in a previous strike. So in this case, I'm not sure that Hamas was using, of course, they anyway used the hospital for their operations, and we've seen that across Gaza. But I think in the case of Ismail Barham, I don't think he was leading a command center from the hospital. I think he was actually being treated there for his previous injuries. But the army, of course, accuses Hamas of using civilian infrastructure for their activities, and that's not something we haven't seen before. Across Gaza, pretty much every hospital in Gaza, we've seen Hamas operatives using the site, and the army's raided the facilities and found weapons there and found evidence of Hamas activity. But I think in this case it's slightly different, that he was actually being treated in the hospital, at least according to what Hamas is saying, and it does seem correct in this case, just based on where he was targeted in the hospital. It was like one specific room in the hospital, in the surgery department, so it does kind of add up there.
But as the IDF has said, or at least the chief of staff or the defense minister so many times, anywhere, anytime, you are a target. Let's go to a short break. And we're back. Defense Minister Yisrael Katz said on Friday that he has instructed the IDF to seize additional areas of the Gaza Strip if Hamas refuses to release the hostages. I'm going to quote from what he said. If the Hamas terror organization continues to refuse to release the hostages, I instructed the IDF to capture additional areas, evacuate the population, and expand the security zone around Gaza for the protection of Israeli communities and IDF soldiers through a permanent hold of the area by Israel. As long as Hamas continues its refusal, it will lose more and more land that will be added to Israel. Now, we reported yesterday, our diplomatic reporter, Lazer Berman, that during a visit to Washington, D.C. this week, the Strategic Affairs Minister, Ron Dermer, will discuss with senior U.S. officials a plan for the Israeli military to control the Gaza Strip. So, Manny, my question to you on this, obviously you can't weigh in on the merits of this idea. The question is, can the IDF physically carry out this threat? Because as we all know, the IDF is suffering from very severe manpower shortages. So is this even possible? Could Israel actually take control of the Gaza Strip and maintain its military presence there indefinitely?
I think it is technically possible. It is interesting that until now the army didn't want to actually do this, and I think that's maybe why we have this perception that it's not possible. Former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant and former IDF Chief Herzi Halevi were both very much against the army taking control of Gaza and having a military authority over the strip and dealing with everything, both civilian and also security there. Yoav Gallant, I think it was in his parting speech after he was fired, said that it would be a huge mistake for Israel to, or in one of his speeches, he said it would be a huge mistake for Israel to do this, and many soldiers would die trying to carry this out or trying to maintain a sort of military government over Gaza. And Herzi Halevi, in private conversations, not publicly, if I remember, has basically said that the army giving out aid in Gaza and the army dealing with civilian affairs would be a terrible idea. From what we understand now, the new defense minister, Katz, he's saying it publicly that Israel should be capturing Gaza. But also Eyal Zamir, the new IDF chief, from what we're hearing from his private conversations, is also more supportive of the army being involved in basically civil affairs in Gaza, giving out aid or maintaining a permanent sort of hold on the strip and dealing with all these other affairs in addition to fighting Hamas. So I think that is technically possible, and I think there's now support even from the military side for such a plan. But like you mentioned, there is an issue of personnel. Reservists are showing up less and less during the war. But maybe this will actually cause reservists to show up. It depends on sort of what the ultimate goal is and the intentions are. I think because the war was dragging on with very little, it felt like there weren't that many achievements. Reservists were less inclined to show up. But if this means that this is the end of Hamas, I think maybe it might spur some reservists to come and rejoin the military and operate. But of course, it could do the opposite, and there are of course many reservists who may think otherwise, who think this is a terrible idea and don't want to be involved in such a plan. But we'll have to, of course, wait and see. But I guess technically it is something possible.
Of course, there is precedent for long-term holding of land, and that is in Lebanon. And over the weekend, of course, 6 rockets were shot from Lebanon into Israel, and Hezbollah terrorists who were shooting at Israel since October 8th, 2023, until relatively recently, claimed that they had nothing to do with it. So, Manny, do you know who actually shot the rockets into Israel over the weekend?
We don't know yet. There are some assessments that it may have been a Palestinian organization, Hamas or Islamic Jihad. I think regardless, it wouldn't have been carried out without Hezbollah's sort of okay or green light, although I could be wrong there. And I know it's difficult to say this, but I do kind of believe Hezbollah here when they say that they didn't fire them, because when we saw what the rocket launchers looked like and the Lebanese army found them afterwards, they're very, very rudimentary. They do not look like anything that Hezbollah has had before. Of course, Hezbollah could have maybe, set up a very, very primitive rocket launchers and fired them anyway to try and prove that it wasn't behind the attack. But I don't think Hezbollah has any incentive to carry out attacks on Israel anyway at this time. And we've seen the army throughout the ceasefire, carry out dozens of strikes in Lebanon against what Israel says are violations of the agreement. And we've only seen Hezbollah respond once with 2 mortars into an empty land in northern Israel where there's no towns. So I don't think there's any incentive for Hezbollah to launch attacks on Israel at this time. And we can see, of course, Israel's response. Dozens and dozens of strikes were carried out in Lebanon in 2 separate waves on Hezbollah facilities and rocket launchers across Lebanon from the south to the north. There was even a Hezbollah official who was apparently targeted in one of these strikes as well. So I don't think Hezbollah is particularly interested in. I mean, they were defeated in Israel's in the conflict with Israel, so I don't think they would want to carry out rocket attacks on Israel again. They only lose from such an event. And these 6 rockets that were fired, 3 of them didn't even cross the border, and the other 3 were intercepted, and no damage or injuries were caused in Israel, and only 1 town siren sounded. So it really does seem to me that some other rogue organization fired these rockets. Maybe with Hezbollah's okay, maybe not. But I think Israel's answer to this kind of attack is very clear now. And if Hezbollah was behind it in one way or another, I think that they would understand now that it's really not worth it to launch a small attack on Israel and then get dozens of your sites bombed in response.
So finally, as you mentioned, the IDF has a new chief of staff, which is Lieutenant General Eyal Zamir. And on Saturday, he announced that he had appointed an external panel of former senior officials to evaluate the military's probes into the Hamas's October 7th, 2023 onslaught and oversee implementation of the findings. Now, Mandy, you and I have discussed several of these probes. They're terrible, damning, really, really hard to get through. And I just wonder, is this new panel that is going to check into the veracity of the probes casting doubt on the findings, or is it more of another measure to make sure that what was discovered here will actually change the course of the IDF?
I think the main point of this panel, from the announcements at least, is to oversee the implementation of the findings. So each of these probes makes various conclusions and recommendations for the army. So this team is, according to the army's announcement, will basically put together the mechanisms and the processes that will enable the implementation of these lessons from the investigations. So they're going to first look, of course, at the conclusions and findings, but the team also is, if Israel, in the statement says at least, that they could re-examine parts of investigations or add to investigations, if they decide that a certain investigation is missing a certain aspect or point that needs adding, and then from there draw new conclusions. And the announcement also says that if necessary, they could recommend, they wouldn't reinvestigate, but they could recommend to reinvestigate entire matters that require it. So if they decide that a certain investigation, if it's a certain battle into a community, or if it's one of the top investigations, they decide that it's not good enough and it needs to be redone and it's a problematic probe, then they can recommend to do so, and then Zamir would have to decide whether or not, who's investigating it and who he would appoint to investigate it. So this team is just looking at all the probes from the outside and helping the army implement all of these recommendations. It's being headed by Sami Turjaman, who's the former head of the Southern Command. There's more than a dozen other members, former Navy Chief Eli Sharvit, former head of the Air Force Amikam Norkin, and there's several other former officers, both men and women from all different parts of the army. And the IDF said that the team is basically was chosen based on their experience with the army, but because they're from all different areas of the military, and it would kind of give a bit more of a diverse perspectives on the investigations. But I don't think it's, for your question, I don't think it's sort of casting doubt on the probes. They were, of course, led by the former chief, Herzi Halevi, but I think there were more than 300 or so investigators involved in all these probes, from all different parts of the army. So it's just to basically check that it's not casting doubts on all of them, but to go through them and make sure that they're all up to spec, and that the actual findings and suggestions that are made can actually be implemented in the army.
Right. And that is the key word here, in the army, because, of course, these probes are not investigating anything outside of the army, only the army's part in what led up to and happened on October 7th. Manny, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. Please check out another installment tomorrow. This episode was produced by the Podwiffs. If you have any comments or questions about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until tomorrow. Shalom.